Hi everyone, my name is Charlie and today is the beginning of another reading vlog, or Booktube Diaries as I've recently taken to calling them, because not a lot happens in these videos. I tend to talk about a reading book, take you on an adventure through the week, which generally is the forest or the towpath, and we're at work. So that's about it. I think it's time I admit something. This is something that I said I wasn't going to do until I had read all of the books on my shelves, but last Thursday the writers group reconvened after taking the summer off, and while waiting for the group to start I was wandering around, and I always go into the children's section just to see if they have Magnus Power Mouse by Dick King-Smith, because even if I can't find a copy in a charity shop, if they got it in the library then I could give it a read. And whilst I was there I saw this book called The Whisperwicks, The Labyrinth of the Lost and Found by Jordan Lees. I was intrigued by the cover, and also the Labyrinth of the Lost and Found reminded me of an aspect of my own children's book, which I couldn't talk about in case the book ever came out one day and there were, it would be spoilers, and I started reading it and immediately got overwhelmed by the sensation of, oh my goodness, this is the creepy sort of autumnal book that I like at this time of year. Well, that was just the prologue. I put the book back on the shelf because I thought, no, we aren't taking any books out of the library right now. I knew that I had only a few books left on my shelves to read. Anyway, I went to the writers group and we had the read around, and the entire time I was sat there I was thinking about this book. And I was thinking about my own children's book, and I was thinking, well, I could read this because we're in the, I'm editing Ellis Valentine, and of the new redraft that I was doing of the children's book, which I haven't looked at since 2018, by the way. I still had 5 chapters left to go back over, or 5 or 7 anyway. I don't know where my plans are for that, but that's another story. When the group finished, I went downstairs and my mum was going to give me a lift, so I just had to wait for her. I thought, I'm gonna go and read that book. And I'd read 50 pages whilst waiting for her. I borrowed the book from the library, and I did talk to you about it because on Friday and Saturday I didn't do any reading because I was editing videos and the like, and yesterday I sat down to read it and I read 200 pages yesterday. It is a brilliant middle grade fantasy adventure, which if you were a child of the 90s, I think you will find something in here that reminds you of a book from that time. There are puppets which are somewhat reminiscent of the demons from His Dark Materials, only this book's a bit more light-hearted. There is, at the beginning of the book, something about the fact that our protagonist, Benjamiah, who doesn't believe in magic, has this very messy brown hair that won't be tamed regardless of what anyone does, and a mean woman with a long neck. And the way that the names are spelt somewhat differently reminds me of the books by Angie Sage. And I just keep seeing all of these allusions to other children's books of the last 30 years, alongside all of these brilliant mentions of books. Benjamiah lives at the moment in the flat above Once Upon a Time bookshop. He's worried that his parents are going to get a divorce. One day somebody delivers a poppet to the shop, and this begins all these mysterious mystical goings on that see him end up in Wreathen World, a place that is devoid of colour, that is under some sort of martial law by the hanged men. And oh my goodness, as I say, it's the perfect autumnal book, and like yesterday it was the perfect weather to read it in because it was torrential rain, and so you could just sit in the corner and hunker down with this book, and it's perfect for that, with some fantastic illustrations. And honestly, it inspired me to go back to my own children's book. I would have finished reading this thing yesterday if I didn't end up thinking about my own children's book so much, and I went back and I read the first 80 pages of my children's book, and I'm talking A4 here. And I love when a book does that. I love when a book inspires me, and this it's an amazing middle grade fantasy adventure, just the sort of thing that I like at this time of year. I like with my middle grade fantasy adventure, and I think that Benjamiah and Elizabella are 2 fantastic characters who both have hardships, and you get to see them not being the kindest, best versions of themselves, but navigating this very scary world, which is labyrinthine, where people regularly get lost, and there are people roaming the streets who haven't seen their families in decades because they left the streets and now they don't know where they are. It is somewhat creepy, but it's not too dark, and I'm so glad I picked it up off the shelf last week. I did manage to walk Sally yesterday and ended up with a nightmare when I got to the bridge, because an entire fleet of families and children were crossing the bridge as I got it, and that's where I turn around, and so I got stuck behind them as I headed back to my car, and they did walk slow. It added a lot of time onto my journey, as did all of the traffic this morning, because it's pouring down with rain. There are temporary traffic lights everywhere, and a load of people came through on red, which meant that when ours turned to green, we couldn't get through anymore. I'm glad to be out of my car, honestly. I was driving for 3/4 of an hour for a journey that usually only takes me 20 minutes. I can't wait for them to be done with these roadworks, but I think that there's at least another 2 months of it. This week, I need to complete my alterations on Mistakes Mean Murder. I think I'm probably going to read a lot more of the Whisperwicks tonight, because it's one of those books that I've even brought it to work with me in the hopes that I'll get to read it at some point today. One of those that when you're not near it, you're thinking about it, and you're thinking about the characters and what they're going to be doing next on their adventure and where the story might go. It's got such fascinating magic in there, and a fascinating world, and the root folk were just inspired. Anyway, I will see you when I see you. It's Wednesday. Yesterday I finished reading The Whisperwicks, The Labyrinth of the Lost and Found by Jordan Lees, illustrated by Vivian Tu, and it is a rather stupendous book to lead you into autumn. I could not stop thinking about this book on Thursday, and indeed when I've not been reading this book I have been thinking about getting back to it and the characters. It's an incredibly fast read, and I would honestly find myself shocked by how much I'd read, but given that it's a middle grade book, that is not surprising. And I was wondering where to place this when it came to middle grade fiction, because there are a few words where I was a bit like, I probably don't know that I would have included that in a children's book given the advice that I was given when I started writing children's books all those years ago. Indeed, when people would read and critique my children's book that I was writing a few years back, one of the comments I would get would be, are you being mindful of the language that you're using, because some of these words children might struggle with? And people would bring this up to debate and say, well, they can look it up or they can learn a new word. And here I was like, no, I'm glad that he's using language that isn't like pandering to a certain age. It's the correct word, and it just adds a sense of more mystery and an enigmatic quality to the prose. I really enjoyed this book as a tale of burgeoning friendship, and as a book lover's book as well. It was a cozy fantasy with bleak elements. It drew on so much from classic children's literature, and when I say classic children's literature, I am talking of the last 30 years, but the author does reference books that are 50 to 60 years old, 100 years old. There's something at the beginning where this Benjamiah realizes that one book this woman wants is actually The Woman in White by Wilkie Collins. I feel like through this book you can tell that Jess Felice loves literature, and I particularly adored that. I adored this world that he's created of the Riedenwald, and really look forward to the sequel. Indeed, I was considering going and purchasing my own copy of this book, because I do think that it's something that I'm going to want to reread, perhaps before the second book comes out next year. I just thought it was perfect, especially towards the end. I have always said that with middle grade fiction, I can usually tell what twists are coming, and the twist at the end of this book, I did not expect at all. It was done so well, and I can't say why it was done well because that will spoil it. My goodness, I hope that the rest of the series, which will continue to explore this world that Lees has created, because you could read this book and call it a standalone, but it had that quality for me, a bit like Alice in Wonderland or Peter Pan or The Wizard of Oz, or did I say Narnia? Narnia as well, where the characters leave the world at the end, but you know there's a sequel, and it's like, what's going to bring them back to this world, and what is the world going to look like when they get there? If you like to read middle grade fiction, or you have somebody in your life who does, I definitely recommend the Whisperwicks. Whilst I am still in a fantastical mood and wish I were reading fantasy, indeed, when I go back to the library tomorrow and return that book, there is a 600-page tome that I'm debating getting because I've read part of it online and I like the sound of it, but I am reading Maps of Imaginary Towns, which is short stories by S.J. Bradley, because I said that I would review this for Fly on the Wall Press. So far I've read 2 stories, and the first one I'm still not quite sure what was happening. I think that it needed a bit more time to breathe so that the reader could feel like it wasn't such a sudden jump to a resolution for that story. The second story was dark and trigger warnings for domestic violence and coercive control in there. I felt like I'd read the story many times before. I'm not saying it's not an important topic to discuss. It felt to me like nothing new was being added to that story or that conversation. I'm also realising now that this book almost blends in to The Wall. S.J. Bradley is certainly somebody who knows how to write and can craft a short story, but I've yet to find myself wowed by the stories in this collection. And then this evening I will be talking to the Italian lady, Una Signora. She has returned from Italy after a month-long sojourn, and so we are going to recommence our conversations, and I'm terrified because this time she has brought me a book back from Italy and she's bought herself a copy, which is La Grande Storia del Mondo by Teresa Buongiorno, Storia di Capolavori. So I can tell from the blurb that this is going to be about the wonders of the world, simply because it talks about per gli antichi le meraviglie del mondo erano sette, the 7 wonders of the world. But it's now saying there are actually many wondrous things on the planet, and I believe that this is going to be talking about them. I don't know whether we're going to start with Noah's Ark and move our way through. We tend to talk about history a lot when we converse with each other because we found that it's a topic that we both enjoy. So we've done Mesopotamia, we've done the Romans. In fact, I found myself quite perturbed by something we found out about a certain Roman female scholar who I believe speculated that the earth moved around the sun as opposed to the earth being the centre of the world, and she was killed for it. They made a film with Rachel Weisz about her where the ending was changed to be more palatable to audiences. Can't remember her name at the moment, but my goodness, when we both found out about that, we both sat there in silence for a bit. I am kind of looking forward to reading this, translating it and learning more about the world and also more about Italian, but I also find it incredibly difficult to translate nowadays, especially when it's been so long since we last spoke. I always find that whenever she goes away and we don't have these conversations, my ability to speak Italian diminishes, despite the fact I'm continuing at Duolingo. So again, that's a case of we will see how that goes, and I'll probably hopefully not end it with one of my headaches that I usually get after speaking Italian for so long. Today, I don't know whether we're going to get out for a walk. The sun has come out, which is a great thing because yesterday it kept pouring down with rain and all morning it's been pouring down with rain. So I'm hoping that it abstains from returning. But right now, my plans are to continue reading Maps of Imaginary Towns and hopefully find some stories that I actually care for in here. S.J. Bradley can write well, and on a craft level she's doing great things, but I'm thinking that it said here that we have immersive worlds that have us traverse chilling dystopias of austerity, and we just haven't got to the futuristic colony or the things that made me accept a copy of this. Anyway, I'll see you when I see you. It's Friday and I am in work in a shirt that I bought from here earlier this week, and maybe too big. It might not be. I don't know. I haven't decided yet, but I'm thinking yes. Either way, as long as we don't grow into it, we're okay. So, continue to read Maps of Imaginary Towns by S.J. Bradley, and all I can say is, if you're a fan of flash fiction, then you'll like some of the smaller wry vignettes that are within this book, and that there are occasions where I absolutely adore S.J. Bradley's voice, what she's chosen to use to tell specific tales. There are some in here where they're just not topics that I particularly want to be reading about, but I understand why the writer has chosen to put them in here. Certain topics feel like they have so much depth that there isn't the space to discuss them within a short story, but then when I think about them further, there is an inevitability to those tales, so really all they need is the short story, because you know that they're not going to go any further, and it's more of an explanation as to how things slip through the cracks. I'm specifically talking about a story with a social worker here. I understood writing it from the social worker's perspective to tell the story, because we only ever see social workers demonized in television, in script, or like in fiction. That's how they usually talked about. I feel like this story wanted to change the opinion but didn't necessarily do enough to do that, yeah. So that's where I am. So far, out of the many stories that I have read, I think that one of the standouts from the collection has been the title story, Maps of Imaginary Towns, because it discussed one of my favourite topics, grief. But otherwise, there are only another 2 stories in this entire collection that I have actually wholeheartedly thought are fantastic short stories. Again, S.J. Bradley can write, and I would recommend this book to flash fiction readers and short story readers. It's not got me as well as I hoped it would. Anyway, I've just arrived to work to a message from my manager telling me that she's been waiting for an x-ray for 2 hours, so I am currently waiting to hear why she is in x-ray. And yes, I am going to be the cruel taskmaster who makes sure that she books it off work, because she's been very strict about us having to book appointments and sick leave and making sure that we always say when we're not going to be here for an hour or 2, so she can do the same darn thing. Yesterday I read from chapter 8 of Mistakes Mean Murder to the writers group. It seemed to go down well. It's a scene in which, for the most part, they're not really discussing the murder, they're discussing dropped hems and fast fashion, but I just felt like I needed to give characters some more character, if that makes any sense, outside of this tale. I've got a few more scenes planned because there's a new character introduced, as I've told you about. Sorry, I was really getting annoyed by this button. There's been a new character introduced, and due to the way that I restructured things, you didn't see this character for 180 pages then, and they're quite important to the plot. I have chosen to write some new scenes. I found one yesterday in my notebook that I'd forgotten I'd written, so that's that. And then there's one scene I want to add in earlier on in the book, and I think that I can do it. I feel like incredibly lucky because the editing this time around, following people's suggestions, hasn't been as mammoth of a task as I expected it to be. I didn't remove one of the huge vital plot points. I understand why Brian said about this and how convoluted it is. I'm just gonna have to go with the whole thing of it's cozy crime and we're going for convoluted here, because I agree that like this character's motivations make no sense. But you know, the book, as I keep saying, is called Mistakes Mean Murder. There is a reason behind that. Anyway, other than that, not much has happened other than taking Sally for a walk, and there were 2 American people who were here on holiday, and they called Sally a cute little doggy and invited her on board, and then said I could go on board as well. I was like, I can't, I've got a writers group. But I'm guessing this is the kind of American hospitality that a cynic like me is not used to, especially in Macclesfield, you know, with northern grumpy people. I mean, not all of them. Actually, maybe it's just me. Maybe it is just me being exceptionally cruel. Anyway, I need coffee, so I am gonna go. The hair is facing in the opposite direction because I slept on that side and there was absolutely no way of sorting out the weird spikiness happening. I looked like Dennis from the Dennis the Menace comics, and my goodness, it's been quite the experience coming into work this morning. As I got to the first roundabout, there are police with their lights flashing and there's only one lane of the carriageway open. Like, I need to be in the lane you're in. And then when I got there, I saw this poor young woman in hysterics. Luckily, I think her father had shown up and he's consoling her because she must have just pulled out of the roundabout and gone straight into something. She has crushed the bonnet on her vehicle. No idea where the other vehicle's gone. I don't know whether it was somebody speeding along or what's happened there, but oh, poor woman. And then I pulled into the car park here, and as I'm drawing into the space, a man turns up and parks next to me. And no, this isn't a dogging scenario. If it was, it would be happening in about 12 hours and it would be pay-per-view. You wanted to donate clothes. It's like, it was 8:20 in the morning. I have very limited hours as to when I'm able to contend with humanity. Let me tell you, at 8:20 on a Saturday morning when I'm listening to Kate Bush, that's not one of the times I can contend with humanity. Hilarious though, because the song was called Love and Anger. That's where we are so far this morning. I'm hoping that his donation isn't a load of tat that would usually get left outside the shop when nobody was here. I'm hopeful. I can't say whether that's for sure, but yeah. So I have already made myself a cup of coffee, and it will probably be drunk before anybody else gets here because that middle room is an absolute mess. So is the kitchen. We had so many donations yesterday, and a particular volunteer was frustrating me because he kept making decisions as though he was managerial. So throwing all of my toys out of the pram, even though it was a whole cutting off my nose to spite my face problem, I kept taking donations just to show him that I could. I'm not management either. I tell you, the tether I have to remaining human is very slim right now. I didn't do much last night because I started a jigsaw on Thursday night. My father's been cleaning, and because he's been cleaning, the table is clean. So I started a jigsaw Thursday night. Only had an hour on it, and then yesterday did some more. I'm fine with the middle bits, you know, the bit where all of the stuff's happening. It's when you get to the outer bits, all that background and scenery I've never been fond of. I don't like doing sky, and I don't like doing the ground. This is why I think I'd be alright in a team. Just let me focus on the big bits, and you can have all the finicky bits that I don't like. And I finished reading Maps of Imaginary Towns, and I am disappointed to say that I didn't care for the collection. Now, this is not because of the storytelling or the craft. As a writer, S.J. Bradley is great, and on a craft level, I can understand why their pieces get published, and I can see on a craft level exactly what they're doing, but it just wasn't the sort of book for me. From the blurb, it made this book sound completely different from what it is. And so I was expecting more stories like the first story that I didn't particularly get on with, but which was more of a dystopic reality and more things of alternative realities. That's what the blurb makes out that it's going to be. Weirdly, the stories that I liked the most were the ones that were grounded in reality and were people just going about their lives. One in particular about a person working at Cineworld but wanting to expand their horizons and go to theatre school. The tone in that was fantastic. There are a few historical errors in there, but the overall story I liked. I think that's it. It was just the stories that were being told weren't necessarily stories that I cared for. This was a case of this just not being a book for me, but I can see why it would appeal to so many people due to the topics that it is discussing. That's fine. I can recognise that this was just a book that I didn't like, but there are going to be so many people who do like this book, not just because of the craft, but because of the stories that the author is telling throughout their stories. So I'll talk more about it in my review on Wednesday. I think this might be a week where I try and begin 1Q84. I don't know, because this is the week like I properly want to finish with my doings of Mistakes Mean Murder. I was making notes last night to make sure I'd included more of this character enough, looking at where I could include further references, whether I thought there needed to be any further references to them. I had another silly moment where I was like, do I just change this plot entirely again? But I need to stop this. I think it's the problem that poets have, and it was something we were talking about at the writers group, and I think other writers have talked about it before, always thinking that there is more that can be done. And I'm like, I need to be done with this story, not least because of how long it's been since the first book came out, but because I want to continue telling the story. And I know that I keep having these thoughts of, do I go back and write a children's book whilst I'm waiting for edits, or do I go straight into book 3? Because book 3 is going to be a bit more difficult for me to write, given that it's now going to have 3 perspectives. Well, it's going to have 1 first person perspective, and if you read Mistakes Mean Murder, you'll figure out who that's going to be from this. And then Alice is going to be in one location and Duke's going to be in another. And sometimes I don't like books like that where the characters split up and you don't see them having any sort of interaction with one another. It's gonna make sense, trust me on this. I have got 5 books planned out of this arc of the cozy crime novels. Is it something I think I'll do again? Probably not, but everybody says I say these things and then I just end up challenging myself. And the thing with the Alice Valentine books is that I've taken a plot that was originally going to be one huge novel in my mind, and I've expanded it over 5 books with the same characters. So there's a lot about all these different stories in my head, and I'm hoping that it'll make sense, and that when everything comes together in book 5, which is a big ask of readers considering it's taken me nearly 5 years to get this book out, and it's like, well, if you continue like this, Charlie, it's going to be 25 years before we can read the flaming 5th book. I promise it won't be that long. So yeah, we will see. We will see what I work on next. But for now, I'm going to go drink my coffee and try and sort a few things before people get here. So if you want to talk about anything I've talked about in this video, please feel free to do so in the comments. I hope that you have enjoyed this video, because until next time, that is all.